Hi there. So yeah, I recently finished a book, and this is not going to be a book review per se. And I wanted to share with you what I learned, some surprises, some misconceptions that I previously had, and how that book helped clear up some of those things in respect to Lewis and Clark.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Sawadee Krupp. I'm Steven, and this is my video log, The Psy American.
So yeah, the book, it's like 484 something pages. I've been reading it off and on. It was actually a bathroom book for most part until the last stretch. Of course, I really got into it, just wanted to finish it off here. But yeah, on and off for the last two months or so, and got through it. And yeah, it was a very interesting book. I actually picked up this book at a thrift store here in Durango. Must have paid like $1, $2 for it. Lewis and Clark. I guess the first thing that attracted me, as an American growing up in the U.S., right? Everyone knows, or should know, at least in my generation, Lewis and Clark, right? And so, but I don't want to say that we really know, because I don't recall it ever being a proper lesson in school, whether in elementary or middle school. It was kind of common knowledge, kind of. But like I said, when I think back to school, I don't really ever remember it being a proper lesson where we actually learned. I mean, most, I guess, kids my age in school kind of would probably know that Lewis and Clark were explorers of the Great West, one of the early explorers of the early nation of the United States of America. That's about it, right? I mean, some might know a little bit more details, and I'm sure in states where theoretically they discovered on behalf of the United States or explored, more or less, they might have gotten a little bit more history. But I didn't really. But it's kind of been a curiosity, and so when I saw this book, here I am in the west of the United States. It's like, oh, that kind of stands out to me. I want to learn a bit about the history. I mean, all I basically I really knew was that they explored a great part of the American West, and that's very blanket, right? So I wanted to find out more, of course, and read a whole book on it. The other thing that comes to mind when you say Lewis and Clark, or Lewis Clark, a lot of people might not even know that they're two people. It might kind of come off as one person. There's always that connotation with Lois Clark, Superman, right? Oh, that's Lois Clark. It's a one person, one explorer. So that it's not one explorer. It's actually two explorers, Lewis and Clark. And I guarantee you, if you ask most people, at least my age or younger, who aren't specific history buffs, if they could name who these two explorers are, their full names, they probably couldn't, and I couldn't, prior to reading this book. And so, but yeah, who are they? They are Meriwether Lewis, was captain, U.S. Army, and William Clark, also captain, but technically, if you read the book, you find out that his rank was actually, technically, he was a lieutenant. So, but anyway, these two leaders of this expedition, which actually had, if I'm not mistaken, 30 people, mostly enlisted men from Kentucky at the time, from Ohio Territory, as well as Indiana Territory, and some from St. Louis, and a few Frenchmen as well, who served as interpreters or enlisted as interpreters, and as well as an Indian, a native woman, a teenager actually. She was pregnant during the expedition and actually had an infant that traveled, from during the expedition. So yeah, it wasn't one person, it wasn't two persons. It was actually 30 people, and they were called the Corps of Discovery, CORPS. And so yeah, this narrative by Stephen Ambrose goes through. It's got, like, I don't know, probably hundreds of references and notes. So it's well researched, and it goes through the narrative of the expedition, leading up to the expedition, during the expedition, and after the expedition. And a lot of surprise information that I picked up from reading this book. How you doing there, buddy? Scooting. Going into the actual expedition, starting 1804, Meriwether Lewis was made a captain by the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Even though Meriwether Lewis, his friend, William Clark from the Army, he also viewed him as a captain, but technically he wasn't a captain. He was made lieutenant, Captain Clark. So they basically, the chain of command, they had to have one captain, but in both of their eyes, they were equals leading into this expedition starting from 1804, and was basically over 2 years, 2 summers, 2 winters. During that period, America was growing rapidly. The United States was growing rapidly, right? And there was still a lot of the old world powers in the new world, in the great continent. There was Spain, of course, there was France, there was Britain, Great Britain. It was also here. Even the Netherlands was in the continent. And so basically this new country, up and coming country of these colonies that had declared independence, and late 18th century and leading into the early 19th century, there was this great Western expansion, and it was all these benchmarks. And one of the big ones in the early 1800s was the Louisiana Purchase. So basically, France had sold this big claim. We want to say it's a claim. I mean, they weren't established in most of what they call the Louisiana Territory. And for those of you who don't know, Louisiana Territory doesn't refer to the modern state of Louisiana, which later was known prior to becoming a state. There was the lower Louisiana Territory and the upper Louisiana Territory. But basically, Louisiana Territory was this huge claim across like maybe a third of the modern day continental United States, extending all the way up to basically the 50th parallel. So where Britain's claim ended, France began going south. There was a claim, just like the Spanish. They had this huge claim over the western swath of the United States, parts of the United States and Mexico as well. But France in its waning days at least sold for really dirt cheap. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was relatively very cheap, this big, huge claim to the United States, to this expanding country where all these settlers were rapidly moving west from their settlements on the East Coast. And so shortly after acquiring the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson had his chance to get his vision to go explore the reaches of it and see how far his territory actually went. And a lot of that was surrounded with the Louisiana Territory was basically the 2 rivers, Missouri River and the Mississippi River. So Missouri River at present day, it merges with the Mississippi River not too far from St. Louis, right? So that's as far as the American Empire at that time, leading into the Louisiana Purchase stretched, to the Mississippi River. So everything west of that was either a Spanish claim or a French claim, in this case French. And of course, the United States had acquired this huge territory, and all that was left to do was to explore it and to bring beyond this claim to actual, to trade in it, to conquer it. And so basically, Meriwether Lewis, he was in the Army, and he had actually worked as an aide for the president during his first term, President Thomas Jefferson. And basically, he can be described as the protege of Thomas Jefferson. He was definitely a frontiersman, and he had a lot of field experience in the Army leading up to that. But he wasn't fully prepared to do the expedition on his own, so Thomas Jefferson had a lot of work bringing him up and getting him trained in the natural sciences, including medical science, botany, geography. And so Thomas Jefferson basically brought Meriwether Lewis into his circle and primed him for this expedition. Got him trained, sent him to Philadelphia with all the smartest intellectuals at the time in the Age of Enlightenment there. And he got them all up to speed on how to use the latest scientific instruments for determining, your latitude and your longitude based on, different calculations and celestial observations. And so a lot of the first part of this book is talking about that part, getting ready for this expedition, and then coinciding with this purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France. And so, the book just goes through the expedition and the months and the years leading into it, and basically how Meriwether Lewis recruited as his second in command, or his equal in their eyes, was William Clark, and promised him, he'd be a captain equal. But of course, there was some politics going on that technically Clark wasn't promoted to captain, but we'll call him Captain Clark. He was definitely dual command for this expedition, and of course they enlisted a lot of men, 30 or so men along the way, because it basically started in Pennsylvania, modern day Pennsylvania, and then going along the Ohio River, and ultimately met up with Clark. Of course, they corresponded originally with a lot of letters, and it took a long time to, wasn't like instant like today, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes months to get correspondence. But anyway, they made it happen, and they ultimately joined up in St. Louis and got all their men and their supplies and everything sorted out, had their camp going. And at that time, St. Louis was this frontier settlement, and then ultimately would make their way upriver. They had a few like keel boats, and they had some canoes, and they called them pirogues, and they loaded them up with all their supplies and their medicine and their instruments, and they basically went upriver. So you can imagine how torturous that would have been. Sometimes they were dragging their boats, from the muddy banks. Sometimes when they got a wind, they would catch the sail, and so they made it all the way up to their first winter camp, and that was like, they went up the Missouri River, so splitting off from the Mississippi onto the Missouri River, and what they called the Mandan villages up in the Dakota territory. And that's as far as most any other American, like fur traders and at the time frontiersmen, had actually gone. And the British were well established throughout Canada and that part of the United States already as traders, frontiersmen as well, already dealing with a lot of the natives. And so they made camp with the Mandans, and there's some natives that were living there already. And yeah, it just basically the whole book. I'm not going to review the whole book and the whole history. I definitely encourage you to read it to learn more. I'm just kind of quick synopsis. Yeah, so after their first winter, they continue west on the Missouri River into modern day both the Dakotas and Montana and Idaho, and where they finally make it to the Rocky Mountains. They ultimately conquered the Rocky Mountains and made it across barely. They barely made it through into modern day Washington and Oregon to the Pacific coast. So they were the first Americans to have made it to the Pacific Ocean by land. Whether or not they were the first white men is, it's hard to say, because like I said, there was a lot of Spanish and British explorers, conquistadors, and frontiersmen in general, and French as well, who had been through that region and had interacted with the natives in the previous century or so. But as far as the first Americans to actually explore and make it to the Pacific Ocean. So anyway, the Corps of Discovery, they set up camp there around, I guess would be modern day, the mouth of the Columbia River, so modern day Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Washington, southern Washington area, and they had to make camp for the winter. Part of their plan, they were hoping, at least by the initial plan with Thomas Jefferson, planning with Captain Lewis and Thomas Jefferson, that maybe he would be able to take a ship back to, via ocean. But then at that time, there was no Panama Canal, so they would have had to go all the way around the Cape Horn, right? So very dangerous and treacherous passage in those days. Take 3 to 4 months to make it to the East Coast again. They apparently didn't meet any other boats or explorers at that time, even though during the Age of Sail, that period, obviously there was a lot of travel by boat, and that coast had been explored a lot by Spain and even the US and Britain as well, trading with the Orient, of course, China, crossing the Pacific Ocean. But making it overland and then trying to scout out the situation with the natives, the different tribes along the way, and the potential for trade route, and basically asserting sovereignty over the Louisiana Territory ultimately, and opening that up, being the pioneers to do that. So it was a very interesting read, and so I encourage you to read it for the full story.
Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West should be available via your preferred online book retailer. Stay tuned for part 2, in which we'll share with you some surprises, wonders, and mysteries that we took away from reading this book. Until next time, thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye. If you like what you see and hear here, be sure to give me likes, comments, and subscribe so as to not miss any updates. Khop khun krap.